Hi everyone, Professor Wills here. I thought we would start our unit um, talking about the word art, what its definition is, how it's been interpreted in history, and if some of those definitions and concepts still hold up in light of what's happened globally in the history of art and in terms of what's even happening in the modern period. So let's pivot to our PowerPoint and I'll show you what I mean. All right, what is art? Here is the dictionary definition from the Oxford Dictionary. Art, the expression or application of human creative skill and imagination, typically in a visual form such as a painting or sculpture, producing works to be appreciated primarily for their beauty or emotional power. Beauty and emotional power. Well, I think by the end of this course, we're going to have some healthy debate about that definition, but it is true that there are countless examples of beauty showcased in art going back to ancient times. Like on the upper left of this PowerPoint is a sculpture, a bust of a very famous Egyptian queen, Nefertiti, going way back to the 14th century BCE. She was a famous beauty with her long neck and fine features. Even her name translates to the beautiful one. So connecting to that dictionary term for our definition of art being beautiful, she fits the bill. Pivoting here, I'll make myself go away for a second, to the bottom right, we have a sculpture in marble by the iconic Renaissance artist Michelangelo, who you may have heard of. This is an era where there is a celebration of the human body and the description of the perfect male physique in this sculpture of David from the famous biblical story, David and Goliath, is an example of male beauty. So talking now about the emotional power of art, maybe some of you have seen the work on the bottom left. This is a painting by Edvard Munch from the late 19th century. It's called The Scream. And you can see here that the point isn't about naturalism. It's about conveying intense feelings and emotion and anxiety. So that definitely has some emotional power indeed. Now, going to the center here, we have a sculpture of this guy named Seneca. He was a first century Roman philosopher, and his famous quote is, "All art is but imitation of nature." So he's saying art imitates nature. But I would disagree, although in the upper right we see this beautiful Chinese screen painting on silk of a landscape. That certainly seems to be imitating nature, so maybe that's what he meant. But I would say there are other instances that I can share with you to show you that sometimes art makes a departure from nature, makes a departure from beauty, and so the rules, the definitions sometimes just don't apply. So let's take a look at what I'm talking about. So on the upper left, we have a serpent mound. You might be able to see this is a form of art made famous in the United States by indigenous peoples in Ohio who constructed earthworks using earth as a sculptural material to create this snake-like form for mysterious reasons. So in this case, not imitating nature, but manipulating nature. On the bottom, below it, we have something that makes you do a double take. It's an example of surrealism. The surrealists were embracing the irrational and the absurd. So in this instance, this female sculptor, Merit Oppenheim, created this object, which is basically a cup and saucer back in 1936. where she's playing with the idea of hard forms turning into soft forms, in this case, a fur-covered cup and saucer. So not necessarily imitating nature, not necessarily creating an object of beauty, but something that's meant to stimulate other visual and mental ideas in the mind. On the upper right, we have an object that isn't meant to be an object of beauty, and it's an object that's meant to represent something imitating nature, like imitating the human body. Instead, it's a ritualistic object from the region of Central Africa known as the Congo. A shaman would use such an object to intercede between the living and the supernatural. And then finally, on the bottom right, we have this cube-shaped sculpture by Eva Hesse. It is from 1968, made up of steel and vinyl. But when you look at the interior of that cube, you can see it's kind of menacing looking with its pins and nails. It's actually rubber tubing, but it's got this kind of sea anemone tentacles reaching out if you were to stick your hand inside with this kind of wiry mesh exterior. This is an art movement called process art, so it's more about creating the work, the process of creating the work, and how it looks at the end of that process versus some kind of messaging. And of course, it's not something necessarily imitating nature. The object isn't to create beauty or even to, evoke emotion. So all of these are considered, important pieces in the history of art, but don't necessarily meet that definition we saw in the Oxford Dictionary. But does the existence of art require a human relationship with an audience to exist? It's like saying if a tree falls down in a forest and no one is around to hear it, does it make a sound? The answer is yes and no, for art can exist, but its meaning to human history can only exist if it connects to us, even just one of us. So an example of that, for instance, goes back to the Stone Age, to cavemen and cave women who literally were entering caves, whether in this case in Europe, but also in Africa and in Indonesia. And over countless generations, they were adding to the walls of these caves myriad handprints, images of animals. So clearly in that era of time, that very early era of art history, there was an audience for this work of art. And then the sands of time went by. These places were forgotten and then rediscovered around the 18th and 19th centuries. And a new audience was awestruck. And so the art exists and now has, meaning and resonance in the Stone Age, and has a new relationship with an audience. Let's circle back to that idea of beauty, because I know it's something we all want to be surrounded with, whether, the things we enjoy, the people we enjoy, or the objects we enjoy. And that's true in art as well. So like a Tinder profile pic, we find ourselves drawn to what's attractive, that we'd like to get to know and spend more time with, making us better people for having known them. And these are examples from art history about beauty. An example of French Impressionism on the upper left. From the 19th century, various French people gathered at a luncheon table with their fancy hats and dresses and embellishments. You may recognize the famous lady of art history on the bottom right. That's Leonardo da Vinci's Mona Lisa. Another famous beauty who still attracts the crowds at the Louvre Museum in Paris, just like a celebrity does nowadays. And then on the top, we have an image of a Mayan king. And I'll fill you in later this term about how he enhanced his beauty, as was part of the culture of Mesoamerica at that time as well. Now, beauty isn't always the point. And so you might know where I'm coming to, what I'm getting to next is that sometimes art isn't about beauty. Sometimes it's about representation of identity, of understanding new identities, of creating things that can be mysterious, challenging, have its own kind of allure. This is what we see in art history as well, and there are a myriad examples of this that we'll talk about in this particular class. So again, beauty, as you see in the pages of Vogue, art, isn't always what's the goal of art history, particularly when you look at portraiture. So overall, defining art isn't an easy thing to do, and that's a good thing because creativity and what defines art shouldn't have a closed definition. Art should always continue to evolve and expand. Even beyond the many art historical styles and isms that we assign different art movements throughout art history. I'm concluding with this example of art that appeared right before COVID hit. It was part of, I think, the 2019 big mega art show in Miami, Art Basel, where one dealer allowed a certain Italian artist to duct tape a banana to the wall, and it was for sale, and lo and behold, it sold for $120,000. So we'll get into the wild world of the art market in this class as well, but clearly it was an Instagram hit. Beauty is in the eye of the beholder, and we'll get more into those concepts throughout this term.